Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Larry.
Okay, thank you, Olivia, and welcome everybody to this virtual visit to the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. This evening, I'm going to tell you about the refuge, and we'll cover its past, which is mostly the past of San Francisco Bay, and what the refuge is like today, and a little peek into the future. Before I continue, I just want to point out the birds on this slide. These are two American avocets. They are shorebirds that are very common at the refuge. And what you see there is their breeding season plumage. That reddish brown color on their heads and necks is only present during a breeding season, which starts about now and extends for a few months into the spring. And the rest of the year, it is gray color on the head and necks. And I will have a picture of that later in this presentation. Before I start talking about Don Edwards, though, I wanted to take a minute to talk about national wildlife refuges in general, for those of you who may not be familiar with them. There are over 560 wildlife refuges in the United States, as you can see by the map on this slide. They are administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a branch of the Department of the Interior. Other organizations within that department are the National Park Service, the Geological Survey, and many, many others having to do with the interior of our country. So National Wildlife Refuges, which were first established in 1903, have the primary goal of protecting habitats, preserving habitats for our wildlife, which includes fish and many other kinds of animals, and also plants as well. The secondary goal, where it's possible to do with consideration, the first goal is to provide access to public lands and waters. And these are public lands because all national wildlife refuges are owned by the federal government. In other words, they are owned by you and me. However, many refuges are either small or just a rough environment and do not allow public visitation, or in some cases, only very limited visitation. Other refuges, including Don Edwards, are open just about every day of the year and have many locations where the public can visit. And later on, I will show you a map and talk about some of the places that you can visit.
Hey, Larry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I do think we are not seeing your shared screen. Hopefully. I know we had it all practiced and tested out.
I forgot to share.
It will be even better when everyone can see the screen.
All right. Yes. My terrible apologies.
No worries at all.
I have lapsed. Let's see.
It's okay. I promise the photos are excellent. It's got a great map going. There we go. Okay,
all
thank
right.
you.
Okay, well, now I better show the avocets again, right?
Yes, we do need to see that plumage.
Nobody saw it. Okay, you should have let me know earlier.
Sorry, I was going to jump in.
Thank you.
So now you're done.
Thank
you, Larry.
All right, so these are the two avocets that I talked about and their coloration, which you couldn't see while I was talking about it, but there it is now. And okay, let me just adjust this and then go back to the second slide that I was talking about. There is the map of the 560 odd refuges throughout the United States and the list of things that we do. And I was saying that in addition to providing visitation for people, many refuges also provide education and interpretation programs, such as this program. Historically, they have been taking places at the refuge, but with the advent of the pandemic, then we switched to having some virtual programs. And now we're kind of in a hybrid. We have returned to having some programs at the refuge, and we are continuing to do ones like this one that people can attend from their homes. if you register to follow the Refuge at the Eventbrite site where you signed up for this one, then you will get notification of additional activities in the future. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about another location on the internet where you can find out what's happening. And finally, at the Refuge, we offer what we call wildlife and open space oriented recreation. So that is pretty much low-key recreation like hiking, biking, photography, things such as that. And also in certain places and under regulations, it offers hunting and fishing as well. There is some of that allowed at Don Edwards. Okay, let's begin by talking about the past. And as I mentioned, this is really talking pretty much about the past of San Francisco Bay. And I break that into three different periods. The first one I call beauty, and that extends from the time when San Francisco Bay was formed as we see it today, which I will talk about, until 1849. And I think you all recognize what 1849 signifies and gives you some idea of why the situation changed at that time. We'll talk a lot more about that. Unfortunately, that event and the people that came here as a result started a period of about a century of abuse of San Francisco Bay in many, many different ways. And I will talk about those. And then in the middle of the 20th century, the situation changed drastically, and we began a period of cleansing and restoration. And we'll talk about that. And it was during that period that this refuge was formed. So let's talk about San Francisco Bay. San Francisco Bay, as we see it today, actually formed about 10,000 years ago. Prior to that time, immediately prior to that time, for some tens of thousands of years, the Earth was in the last ice age. And the sea levels or water levels all over the planet were much lower because most of the planet's water was trapped on continents in the form of glaciers. So where San Francisco Bay is today, there was literally a valley. And since this is a temperate region, that it was a valley filled with plants and animals and some flowing water. And it was an area where life could thrive instead or in spite of the ice age. About 10,000 years ago, or a little sooner than that, the Earth started warming, the glaciers started melting, the water level started rising, and water started flowing into this valley to form San Francisco Bay. The water came in from two directions. It came in from the west, from the Pacific Ocean through the Golden Gate, and that was salt water. And it came in from the east, down from the Sierra Nevada, through the rivers leading out of the Sierra Nevada and leading west, through the delta, the mouths of the rivers, and through the bays in north of us, and finally into San Francisco Bay. And that water was freshwater, rainwater. And so the combination of those two is what makes San Francisco Bay an estuary, which is simply defined as the place where salt water and freshwater meet. And estuaries are very important environments for a wide variety of life. And this one especially so because of our temperate climate in this area. San Francisco Bay, after it filled to its current level, was actually much larger and much deeper than it is today. And we'll talk about how that transformation happened. But to give you a sense of it, the surface area of San Francisco Bay was about 50% larger before settlement started than it is today. And most of that surface area that no longer exists was in the form of tidal marshes. Marshes are like what is pictured here. They are areas where the land is at or just above the water level, and it is a place where plants grow, as you see here, and where there is aquatic life in the water. And these marshes pretty much surrounded all of San Francisco Bay. The water flowing through it that you see there comes in from San Francisco Bay. So it is tidal, it rises and falls with the tide, and it brings in water into the marsh and takes it out. So that kind of makes the marsh into a living thing with the water refreshing it periodically. This particular marsh is a picture of a marsh in the Napa-Sonoma area, which is a marsh that has never been altered by humans. Many of the marshes that exist around San Francisco Bay today have had a past history of being modified, as we'll talk about. But this one is just as it looked in the 1840s. The life in the San Francisco Bay and the Bay Area back at the time was very abundant. The water, the bay, and the sloughs contained marine mammals, including sea otters and sea lions, a large variety of fish, crustaceans, and other forms of sea life. Also in the area were a large number of birds. There are birds that lived in this area all year round, and migratory birds that would stop here primarily during the fall and the spring migration seasons as they were on their way to either northern or southern areas. To give you a little idea of the magnitude of it, when some explorers, Spanish explorers, first came to this area in the 18th century, one of them called this place a paradise for wildlife. Another noted that there were so many birds that when a flock of birds flew overhead, they were so dense that they blocked out the sun. And another noticed that the fish were so abundant in the streams and the rivers that it appeared that you could literally walk across the water on the back of the fish. We don't have that quantity of wildlife around San Francisco Bay anymore, that's for certain. So let's talk a little bit about the tidal marshes, because that is a very important part of the story of San Francisco Bay and the story of the refuge. So this is another marsh that you see here. You can see that the land to the right is just about at the water level. This is at high tide. And you can see that there's water flowing through the land, and there is dense plant growth in that area. And then on the left-hand side, there is more plant growth. The land is a little bit higher, so it doesn't get inundated with every high tide, but it probably gets inundated during periods when we have very high tides called king tides, generally during the winter. And of course, it will get very wet during storms and things as well. The water that you see there in the slough and in the bay in the distance contains plankton, the very bottom of the food chain. There is plant plankton, which is called phytoplankton, and there are tiny animals, which are called zooplankton. Plant plankton, along with the plants on land, form the bottom of the food chain because plants are the living things that absorb sunlight and turn that into sugars and other chemicals that then create the plants and then provide nourishment to animals. And these marshes are essentially vital for all life on planet Earth. And of course, if there were no bottom of the food chain, there would be no higher levels of the food chain either. So the plants that you see here and plants throughout tidal marsh areas, like all other plants, absorb carbon dioxide and emit oxygen. And as you see in this picture, the plants grow very dense in tidal marshes. In fact, for a given area of land, the plants produce more oxygen per that unit of area than is produced in a rainforest. So very critical for us. The marshes also provide sanctuary for a number of animals. Migratory birds visit it and go get a lot of food there. Small fish are in the water and provide some sanctuary there because some of their predators, larger fish, cannot get into the shallow waters of the tidal marsh. So it gives them some protection, but those fish are food for many of the birds in that visit the marsh. There are some mammals that live in the marshland. The salt marsh harvest mouse and Ridgway's rail, which is a bird, are two that we're going to talk about. And we'll describe them more later. So I won't go on about them now. Marshes serve two other purposes, which are important now to us since we live here in this area. First of all, marshes absorb water. So in times of high tides and in times of very high tides and storms, the marshes will absorb some of that water that overflows from the bay and thereby protects the nearby land from being flooded. And now much of that land is settled by people. So the marshes help to prevent flooding in areas where we live. Also, the marshes act as filters when water is going the other way. During normal times, during, say, the rainy season, water comes down from the hills on both sides of San Francisco Bay and makes its way into the bay. And now that this is a very crowded urban area, that water picks up a lot of pollutants on its way down, pollutants such as oil and gas and pesticides and dirt and any number of other things. But when that water approaches the bay, some of it instead actually gets into marshes, and the marshes will trap those pollutants and keep them there until they can decompose, thereby keeping them out of San Francisco Bay. So these marshes have a many important functions for all life on Earth and for us who live in the area. So now let's talk about what happened starting in 1849, which of course was the beginning of the gold rush. And as word about the discovery of gold, which actually happened in early 1848, got out, people came to this area, mostly by sea, coming to San Francisco and picking up supplies and going up into the Sierra Nevadas. And they picked up gold by panning in rivers or digging through the soil and picking up pebbles and little rocks of gold. And that was the case for a few years. But that gold, which I call the easy gold, really only lasted a very short time because there were so many prospectors and the area got picked over very quickly. There was still, however, a large quantity of gold in the soil as little tiny flecks of gold. And that could not be gotten by a prospector with tools. It took a totally different method, and that's called hydraulic mining. And you see that in the top picture on the slide. So after a few years, when the prospectors dispersed, mining companies moved in, and they started this process. And the way this process worked was, first of all, they had to clear a hillside. So they got rid of all the trees and bushes that grew on the hillside. Then they would use jets of water to wash the soil down into a stream. These jets came from water at higher altitudes where they would trap water, or especially water as ice melted in the spring and summer. And they would bring it down to lower altitudes through those pipes. And as the gravity worked and the constriction of the pipes, by the time they got to the jet or the nozzle at the end of the pipe, this was a very forceful stream of water, just as you see here. So now we have soil running down into a stream of water. And that soil contains, or was mixed with, gold particles. So to separate the gold, what was done was to mix liquid mercury into that water. Mercury is a metallic substance, silver in color, and is a liquid at normal temperatures. Mercury also has the ability or the property of combining with gold. You simply mix the two together, and the two clump together to form an amalgam, which is a type of alloy. And that forms actual rocky clumps, which are heavy in the water, and they sink out of the water and can be captured. The rest of this water, which contains a lot of sediment and also contains some leftover mercury, is just discarded. And we'll talk about the results of that in a minute. Meanwhile, the miners are now left with these rocks of amalgamated mercury and gold, and they heat that, and mercury doesn't have to be too hot before it starts decomposing, or actually the amalgam decomposes and separates back into mercury plus gold. The mercury then comes off as a vapor, and what's left is the pure gold. And so the mining companies have their gold. This vapor, some of it gets trapped and cooled, so it can be recycled after it's cooled back as a liquid, but not all of it gets trapped. This was not a closed nor a careful process. So some of it gets into the soil. Some of it goes off into the air before it eventually cools. And so it spreads out and contaminates the soil even beyond the area where it was mining. Meanwhile, that water with the sediment starts flowing down into the creeks and rivers, and some of that sediment settles out. So over time, these waterways become less and less deep and have less and less ability to hold or carry water. And this holds true after the water comes down. It comes down through the delta, which is the mouths of the rivers near Sacramento. And then it starts flowing into Suisun Bay and San Pablo Bay and into San Francisco Bay. And it's filling up all of these waterways and making them less deep. So remember when I said at the beginning that San Francisco Bay is not as deep as it used to be? That's the reason why. And remember that water contains some mercury, because not all the mercury joins with gold when it's mixed, or when it was mixed. So this is polluted, sediment-filled water that has been coming down into San Francisco Bay. To give you an idea of some of the magnitude of the extent of this mining, the mercury that the miners used actually came from the San Francisco Bay area. Mercury exists in the coastal range, which are the mountains along the Pacific coast, and it exists there as a mineral called cinnabar. It's a reddish, powdery mineral. So mercury mines sprung up all along the coast range. Again, there were no regulations, so anybody who owned land there could start digging a mine. And once you dug a mine and got some of the cinnabar out, it again gets heated, and it doesn't have to get too hot. And the mercury comes off as a vapor, and it's trapped and cooled. And now we have almost pure liquid metallic mercury. That mercury was put in bottles of about the size of a quart, and sent in ships, which went from harbors in San Jose or along the peninsula up to San Francisco, where it was transferred to other ships and brought up to the mines in the Sierra Nevada. So during the course of the gold rush, which was the dates that were there, well, it started a little later than that, but ran through 1884, 7.5 million pounds of mercury was sent up. That's how much was used. And imagine if just 10 or 15% of that got into the water, how much mercury is in the water that has come down from the Sierra Nevada. And as for the sediment, the amount of sediment has been estimated at 1.5 billion cubic yards during the period of the gold rush. Now, I said billion, not million. And a cubic yard is a yard wide by a yard long by a yard high. So imagine billion, more than a billion of those. And as a result, all those creeks and rivers in the Sierra Nevada could no longer carry water. And when those rivers got down to the Central Valley, they couldn't carry that much water either. And they started causing floods. The waterways would overflow. And that's what actually put a stop to the hydraulic mining. In 1884, the farmers had sued the mining companies saying, you're destroying our farms. And the courts agreed with them and put a stop to the hydraulic mining in the Sierra Nevada. But the problems from that did not end with the end of mining. In fact, we're still getting that sediment and that contamination today. In the bottom picture, you see what is now a California State Park. And you can see that hillside that is still bare. And when there is rain from the winter storms, some of that dirt, which contains mercury, washes down and all the way makes its way to San Francisco Bay. And as a result, the central part of San Francisco Bay, which supports commerce, big ships and oil tankers, has to be dredged every year. The federal government does that dredging and is paid for by tax dollars. So you and I today are paying for the environmental damage that was caused more than 150 years ago in the gold rush. So that's one of the things that I mean by abuse. And in terms of the sediment in San Francisco Bay, on average over the whole bay, that sediment made the bay 8 inches shallower, or raised the bed of the bay by 8 inches. Now, you may think 8 inches is not a lot, but first of all, San Francisco Bay, even in its smaller state today, is quite huge. And secondly, the depth of San Francisco Bay before that was only about an average of 14 feet. So to make it less deep by 2/3 of a foot, that's a significant change. So that's kind of the magnitude of the changes that we did get and we still have from the gold rush. But we're not finished. We have another precious metal to talk about, silver. There was a big strike of silver in 1859 by initially near Reno, Nevada, but turned out that this was a huge area that is filled with silver, both in the eastern part of California and the western part of Nevada. Silver is mined. It is not mined with hydraulic mining. It's traditional mining with shafts and tunnels. But silver exists as an ore, and that ore has to be processed, and some chemicals are needed for that process. One chemical is mercury, because it amalgamates with silver just the way it amalgamates with gold. But there's another chemical needed to treat the ore first, and that is chlorine. And so the mining companies of the Comstock lode, which is what this silver find came to be called, needed a source of chlorine. Well, the easiest way to get chlorine is from salt, common table salt, which is sodium chloride. And it's very easy chemically to separate the sodium and chloride and get chlorine. But where do they get sodium chloride? Well, salt. That's in salt water. There's this big body of water full of salt water, not too far away. And that's exactly what happened. Let me go back and talk a little bit about salt. Salt was for many thousands of years a very, very valuable commodity because of its property of being used for food preservation. Meat and fish, when it was captured for food, could only stay fresh for maybe 2 or 3 days in a temperate climate or a warm climate. But if you salt fish, it then lasts for weeks. In the 16th or 17th and 18th centuries, the French would fish off the coast of Newfoundland, now part of Canada, and they would capture cod there. And they would salt it, and then they could take it back to France, which took about a week to cross the Atlantic, and they could distribute it throughout France, which took at least several more days, and it was still edible. That's how important salt was for many things. In around San Francisco Bay, in the East Bay, there were some areas where the San Francisco Bay water would come in during the high tides in the winter. But during the spring and summer, the area was sealed off from San Francisco Bay. So the salt water that had come in evaporates, leaving salt. The Native Americans that lived in the area would harvest this salt, and the settlers that came in starting in the 18th century would also learn to harvest the salt. It was right there. But starting with the Comstock lode, now there was a very big demand for salt. And people said, wait, we can do the same thing ourselves. And they started to create salt ponds around San Francisco Bay. And conceptually, this is very easy. You build a levee around the edge of the bay, including some of those tidal marshes that we talked about. You then dredge that area, get rid of all those useless plants and other things in the area, and pump in bay water until it fills up, and then let it sit during our long dry summers, and you wind up with salt. And thus the creation of salt ponds. And it happened very quickly. Salt ponds tended to be huge, like hundreds of acres or bigger. And it took only 4 years from the time when the Comstock lode began until there were 18 such ponds around San Francisco Bay. And what you see here in this contemporary picture are salt ponds, which still exist today. The demand for salt from mining obviously decreased towards the end of the 19th century, but that was the period of industrialization. It turns out salt is used in many, many industrial processes, as well as having other uses for food and things like that. And so the demand for salt kept increasing, and salt ponds continued to be built around San Francisco Bay until the time of World War II. And although not as much as then, we still have salt ponds today around the bay. And that's what you see in this picture here. This is the East Bay in the Newark and Fremont area. That's the Dumbarton Bridge at the top of this photograph. And all those colored areas that you see are salt ponds. The areas closest to the bay are actually areas that are part of the refuge, but in which permission has been granted for Cargill Corporation, which owns all the salt ponds, to continue to harvest salt. And I'll talk more about later when we talk about the formation of the refuge. But those green and orange areas that you see, that is slightly salty water, saltier than the bay. And the colors come from bacteria and algae that live in that very salty water. As the water gets saltier, different kinds of microscopic creatures come in there, and the water changes color again, and it turns bright red, which is what you see. And then you see a couple of white patches. That's where pretty much all the water has evaporated, and that is the salt that's left over. The area down towards the bottom of the photo, which has got these rectangular spaces, that is area that is still completely owned by Cargill Corporation. But these other areas that you see with the oddly shaped ponds are part of the refuge. And this dark area is existing tidal marshes, and they actually extend a little bit inland and through some of the refuge area as well. So this is how we lost a lot of the tidal marshes. They were simply destroyed for salt ponds. And when I talk about San Francisco Bay being smaller, these salt ponds are not part of San Francisco Bay. They are privately owned land that is being used for production of salt. All right, another way that we lost a lot of the tidal marshes is very simply bay fill, right? For a salt pond, or for some things like a marina, you dredge the area and get rid of the tidal marshes. For other purposes, such as you see here, you fill in the area and you destroy the tidal marshes. On the picture on the bottom right, you see Foster City in San Mateo County, and that's Highway 92 going through the center of the photo, and then the San Mateo Hayward Bridge. And all that area used to be tidal marshes, used to be part of San Francisco Bay. At the bottom right, you see Chase Center and the surrounding buildings. That's an area which today we call Mission Bay. And the reason we call it that is it was a bay. It was a sort of a semicircle carved out of the eastern side of San Francisco, filled with water that was part of San Francisco Bay, but it had its own name, Mission Bay. And that water was used by the Native Americans and even some of the earlier settlers. It was, fresh bay water. It was used for swimming. It was used for fishing. But as more and more people came to this area, it got polluted and got filled with garbage. And eventually it was just all filled in and became part of the city of San Francisco. And it had several different uses over the years from the late 19th century. And today it is the home of Chase Center and many industrial and residential buildings as well. And there on the top, you see the beginning of San Francisco Airport, which is also built on bay fill. So this is the other major reason why San Francisco Bay is a lot smaller than it used to be. And I'll show you a little more specifically about that with this map. In the inset, it shows the tidal marshes, that green color, surrounding San Francisco Bay about 1800. And then the larger map shows you with different colors all the things that have replaced San Francisco Bay, whether it's salt pond or developed areas or agricultural areas. And you see that nearly all that green is gone. And as it says there in the explanation, by the peak of the using San Francisco, parts of San Francisco Bay for other things, 90% of the tidal marshes were destroyed. And as I'll get to in a minute, then around the beginning of or the middle of the 20th century, we started restoring some of those tidal marshes. And so the percentage of marshland has increased since then. And as it says here, there's a goal to try to get it back to 40% of its historical amount. But that's going to be sometime in the future. So the last part of abuse, besides all the ones that we talked about, was just plain old pollution. So ever since settlers started coming to this area, San Francisco Bay was the place where you got rid of raw sewage. It's the place where you dumped your garbage, because in both cases, high tide came in, picked up all this debris, all this waste, and took it out. And back in 1850s, 1860s, that worked because there were so few people. But by the time we get to the 20th century, and this area is populated greatly, and those practices still exist, and we add to that industrial pollution from all those industries that you see there, some of which still exist today, the bay was a mess by the middle of the 20th century. It was literally a cesspool. You see some of the pictures there. That's garbage being dumped at the edge of the bay. There were, city waste dumps that were like official dumps, but it was also perfectly legal for you to drive up to some place where you could access the bay and just dump your garbage there. And to the right of that, there is a pipe letting raw sewage into San Francisco Bay. And then the sign that I showed there is the result of all this pollution, that the fish and shellfish from the area cannot be eaten. And the water itself is very harmful. Just going into the water could make you sick. That was the state of San Francisco Bay. And to give you an idea of the magnitude of this, in 1960, 250 million gallons of raw sewage was dumped in San Francisco Bay, not every month, not every week, but every day. 250 million gallons per day. Now, you may not be able to picture that amount. I certainly can't, but let me give you a way that helps you do that. You are probably familiar with Levi Stadium, having seen it on TV if you have not driven by it or attended an event there. It's a large stadium. If you filled that stadium with liquid, it would be 30 million gallons. So the 250 million gallon is 8 Levi Stadium full of raw sewage being dumped into San Francisco Bay every day in 1960. That's what created the cesspool, along with all this other pollution. So that was the situation. But we know that's not the case now. San Francisco Bay is not a cesspool. It's not the sparkling blue that it was in the 1840s, but it's certainly not a cesspool. And we don't have, free garbage dumping, and we don't have at least legal raw sewage going into the bay. So what happened? Well, we entered phase 3, restoration. And the overall situation was, after World War II, as we got into the 1950s and the 1960s, public attitudes started changing, started focusing more on the environment and cleaning it up, and started focusing on, hey, this San Francisco Bay could be a really good recreational area. It could be good for surface transportation if we could get it cleaned up. And those marshes, they weren't the wasteland that people used to think they were. Maybe we can restore some of them. Well, that was the public sentiment, but there has to be a catalyst to take that public sentiment and channel it. And that catalyst was those three ladies that you see there in the picture. From the woman standing is Kay Kerr, or Catherine Kerr, and then Esther Gulick and Sylvia McLaughlin. They lived in Berkeley. They were each married to important men at the University of California. Kay Kerr's husband, Clark Kerr, was the president of the UC Board of Regents, so he was responsible for all of University of California. And they were friends, and they lived in houses up in the hills, of course, and they could see San Francisco Bay. They knew what was happening to San Francisco Bay, and they said, we need to get something going here. And as a result, they were well connected because of their husband's importance. And so they were able to call a meeting at one of their houses of the heads of what today we call environmental organizations, the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, the Save the Redwoods League, organizations like that. And they also invited a reporter to come to the meeting, which is how we know exactly what happened there. And the three women made their pitch and essentially said, hey, we need to stop this destruction of San Francisco Bay. And there were plans for literal destruction. I mean, I talked about the Bayfill that did happen, like Foster City. There were plans for a lot more Bayfill as well. And the women did not want to see that. And they wanted to cut out all this pollution that was happening as well. And the men said pretty much, well, we're really busy saving the trees and the birds and the wildernesses and whatever. And we think San Francisco Bay is a lost cause. It's just too far gone. And filling it is really the only solution. But they said, if you women, not necessarily in those terms, but what they meant was, if you, the hosts of this meeting, want to do something and start working on it yourselves, we'll support you. We'll give you advice. We'll give you our membership lists, which was legal in those days. And the women took up the challenge. And in 1961, they formed an organization called Save San Francisco Bay. I'm sorry, at the time it was called the Save San Francisco Bay Association. That was the name at the beginning. And they started doing publicity. And they used a map which showed how little of the bay would be left if all the Bayfill plans would occur. And they said, do you want San Francisco Bay or do you want San Francisco River? Because that's all that would be left. It would be shrunk so much. And this worked, and they started getting members. And they took those members and they encouraged them to go to city council meetings and board of supervisor meetings. And they bussed them to Sacramento to go to the legislature. And all these supporters went to the politicians and said, stop the pollution, stop the Bayfill, let's clean up and restore San Francisco Bay. And it worked. The legislators heard the people, as it were, and they set up a commission called the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which was established in 1964 with rules that no more pollution, no more raw sewage, permit is needed for dumping and filling San Francisco Bay. And the transformation started. And you can see kind of the public support there with the family fishing and a sign that said, Save the Bay for us. And by 1969, that commission was made permanent. And in fact, it still exists today and does the same sort of thing. And the bay began to get cleaned up and transformed and restored. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And the organization still exists today. It's called Save the Bay. The web address, the website is there, and Olivia will put that in the chat. And I suggest you visit their site and see what it is that they're doing and what kinds of things they are still working on today. So that took care of San Francisco Bay. But what about those salt ponds? Remember I said the salt ponds are not part of San Francisco Bay. And so they were not covered by the BCDC's jurisdiction, or so people thought. And I don't know if it was ever formally tested in the courts, but there were people who said, we also need to do something about these salt ponds. And at the time, in the middle of the 20th century, the company that owned them all, Cargill, was starting to reduce the amount of area that it used for salt. We don't know exactly why, but some of it might be reduced demand for salt. Some of it might be just the cost of doing that in the Bay Area when they could do it more cheaply somewhere else. But again, it took some people to catalyze that, to take those ideas and make them happen. And there was one person who actually did the bulk of that, and that is the gentleman we see there on the left, Arthur Ogilvie. He worked for Santa Clara County as a planner. And so he was fully aware of plans that were being made to fill and develop the salt ponds in the southern part of San Francisco Bay. One of the plans was a big recreational park to go in part of the salt ponds, and he didn't want to see that. So he knew at the time the federal government was very in favor of environmental preservation and restoration, and he began to talk to the Department of the Interior about the possibility of forming a national wildlife refuge. And that was a radical idea at the time, because even though there were hundreds of refuges already, none of them were in a densely populated urban area like this one. And so proposing a wildlife refuge to be literally 10 miles from downtown San Jose was a radical thought. But he pursued it, and he got a favorable reception there. But he knew he couldn't do it all alone. So he literally put an ad in the newspaper. He set up a meeting, and he said, citizens who want to help me, please come to the meeting. And one of those people who responded was Florence Leverrier, who we see in the picture, and her husband, Philip, who has since passed away, but Florence is still very much with us. And so the two of them, along with many others, took this plan and again started drumming up public support and did publicity. I saw some of the stuff. They had mugs, which had their plan on it, and they printed their plan onto paper grocery bags and gave them out to the supermarkets. They did a lot of publicity. And so public support did start happening. And they went to one of the congressmen from San Jose, Don Edwards, and they got him involved. And he wrote the bill that created the refuge, because it takes a law to create a national wildlife refuge. And he shepherded it through Congress, and it passed Congress. And it was signed by President Richard Nixon on June 30th, 1972. So just a little over 50 years ago, the refuge itself was created. And it didn't, at that time, have any land, but that was the base, the beginning of what they could do. And you'll see as I go along how that developed. So later on, as a recognition of the work of those people, Arthur Ogilvie got an island named after him. It is an island located near the mouth of Coyote Creek, where it empties into San Francisco Bay. So it's either in San Jose or Milpitas. I'm not sure which city it is within the boundary of. One of the restored marshes in the refuge in our Fremont facility was named after La Riviers, and it's one of the marshes that has some trails going through it. I'll talk about that in a minute. And it's named after them. And Don Edwards, well, he got the whole refuge named after him. His name was added to the refuge in 1995. when he retired from Congress. So I want to look a little bit at the bigger picture of what happened, what has happened since that time period. And you look at this map of the South Bay, take a look at all the lines, all the areas that are shaded with diagonal lines. And as it says in the key here, those are protected lands. So most of this is the refuge, but not all of it. But all of these shaded lands are now protected from any development. We start with an area called Eden Landing, a fairly large one. That one belongs to the state of California and is administered by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Then we get down to the refuge, and this is some refuge land that, as I mentioned before, is owned by Cargill, but the refuge land, that area is owned by the refuge, but the terms of in which it was transferred from Cargill to the refuge said, Cargill, you can keep harvesting salt as long as you would like to do that. And as you saw from that picture earlier, they are still doing it. And these pink areas are where there are still salt ponds. The shaded parts are part of the refuge. The unshaded parts are still owned by Cargill. And then we get down to San Jose area and the area of Alviso, which is a community within San Jose. And much of this area is now protected and part of the refuge. Some of it has been restored, not all of it. We'll talk more about that. And then we get into some areas here which are owned locally by Mountain View and Palo Alto. And there's more refuge area here, which is known as the Ravenswood area in Menlo Park and East Palo Alto. And some areas here that have been preserved that are part of Redwood City, including Bear Island. Bear Island was a story in and of itself, which I won't go into. Cargill, when it owned it, threatened development. When they couldn't develop it, they sold it to a Japanese company that wanted to develop it. In both cases, when Cargill owned it, when the Japanese company owned it, it was another concerned group of citizens that got together and pushed for the preservation of Bear Island. And eventually they succeeded with that on a vote of the citizens of Redwood City, who determined the zoning of the area and whether it could be developed or not. And they voted that it should not be developed. And so eventually that land became part of the refuge and has been restored since then. So it took 40 years from the time, well, 30 years actually, from the time of the founding of the refuge until the refuge gained enough land that it had control over, unlike this area where it became part of the refuge, but the refuge can do nothing as long as Cargill is harvesting salt. These other areas down here are parts of the refuge, which the refuge owns outright. And in 2008, a large project was started called the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. As you can see here, a lot of it is in the refuge, and it also covers part of the area up in Eden Landing belonging to the state of California. That project started in 2008, and phase one was completed, which consists of some area in all these blue circles, part of Eden Landing, parts of the refuge in San Jose Alviso, and this part here in the Menlo Park area as well was restored during phase one. And this area, which is called SF2 for Sulfur 2, I will talk about more in a couple of minutes. So let's take a look at the refuge today. You can see that it encompasses the preserved areas that on the previous slide, most of the areas. So this is Don Edwards today. We'll talk about which parts are open for visitation on the next slide. But in total, the refuge is some 30,000 acres. So it has become a pretty sizable refuge, and it preserves a lot of the area around the southern part of San Francisco Bay. Oops, a little bit. Okay, here is another map, which is oriented towards visitors to Don Edwards. As I said, Don Edwards is open every day of the year except for 3 holidays: Thanksgiving, Christmas Day, and New Year's Day. And this map shows that we have 16 different trails that you can use to go through the refuge. And I will talk about some of those. Trails 1, 2, and 5 are in the area, are in Fremont, and is the area where our headquarters is located, and some other facilities and some education facilities as well. Trail number 2, you can see, is the La Riviere Marsh Trail. So that is a trail which has a boardwalk that you can walk literally through part of the marsh. And then there's a levee in the middle of the marsh that you can walk along. So you can walk in this marsh that was named after the La Rivieres, who were crucial in the formation of the refuge. This marsh is actually one of the restored salt ponds. It was a salt pond in the early 20th century. It was abandoned around the 1950s, and it just sat there as wasted land. And eventually the refuge took it over, and now it is a marsh with all the properties that I talked about and very abundant wildlife in that area. The trails 8, 9, and 10 are in Alviso. This is another area where we have facilities. We call that the Environmental Education Center, that has mostly educational facilities, but also some other visitor facilities. That facility closed at the beginning of the pandemic, and it has remained closed because now there is construction in the area, which I will talk about. So there are some open trails there, but most of the trail space now is not accessible and will not be accessible until sometime next year based on their schedule. So you can visit it if you happen to be in the area. You can walk along some of the marshes and things like that, but you can't really take a long walk in the area. I should mention that both at Fremont, which has our visitor center, and at Alviso, there are restroom facilities available. So Trail 15 is in this area called SF2, which is another salt pond that has been restored to a marsh. It is just south of Highway 84 and is easily accessible. In a frontage road that you can get to from either direction on Highway 84. It has a trail, a short trail, 7/10 of a mile. And I have to say that of the trails I've been on throughout the refuge, this is my favorite. I've been on that trail maybe a half dozen times. Every time I've been there, I've seen a large quantity of birds, and I've seen many different species of birds each time I've been there. So it's a lot of fun to visit. It's a very easy walk. There are benches. There is a restroom facility. There are some explanatory kiosks. A great place to visit. And finally, I will mention Bear Island, which I talked about, which has been restored. And there's a trail on the southwestern portion, fairly close to Highway 101. It's easily accessible from Highway 101. There's a parking lot there, a restroom facility, and trails that are about 1.7 miles out and then walk back. There are some benches and viewing facilities whatever. So many, many trails and opportunities for you to visit Don Edwards. You can find out about these trails. You can get directions on how to get to each of them from the official website, which I have shown down there on the slide. And Olivia will post that URL in the chat as well. So let's take a look some more at Don Edwards today. Here are some of the things that go on. You see a group that's hiking and a group that's biking. Both of those are very popular. You see one of our staff members, Miguel, and he's there with a birthday party. So small gatherings and things like that, or parties, luncheon picnics, things like that are great to have with, as I said before, the condition that you clean up after yourselves and the area should just look identical when you leave to the way it looked when you arrived. But within that, you're welcome to use some of our beautiful scenic facilities for, just one or two people or for a group. At the bottom is one of our educational classes. This is a class of 6th graders at our Fremont location. And within Fremont, there are some natural hills, and you can walk up the hills, and that's where this picture was taken. And there are some beautiful views of the bay from there. It's a popular spot at sunset because you're facing pretty much due west and get some great sunset pictures there. This is a class, and we walked them up this hill, and that's our educational coordinator in the brown jacket, and she's pointing out some of the sites that you can see very clearly from that location. Some of our programs, some of the educational programs, some of the interpretive programs like this one, some of the staff members like Olivia are actually part of a nonprofit organization called the San Francisco Bay Wildlife Society. So that organization funds activities that are beyond the federal budget for the wildlife, but are very important for people, for students, to give them opportunity to come to the refuge and so on and so forth. So I have their website there. I suggest you visit the website. It has a quarterly newsletter, which has information about this refuge and the other refuges in the Bay Area. It also has an events calendar, so you can see what's happening in the refuge and events you might want to attend. And it is a nonprofit that survives on donations. So if you can and you're willing, then please make a donation to the society and help fund these activities.
Thank you, Larry. And we have a quick question from the chat, if you're okay to
Sure.
take one.
Yeah.
Wendy was just wondering which hike it was you said was your favorite. I know you love SF2. I can't remember what you just said was your favorite hike, though.
Yeah, that one is, I mean, I like a lot of them, but SF2 is my favorite because I've seen the most birds there. I have a couple of pictures of that. I can go back to the map and point it out again. There is a frontage road along both sides of Highway 84, and those two sides connect just before the bridge, and there are entrances right along 84. So from either direction, you can take that frontage road. There's a parking lot right where that number 15 is, and that's where the trail is, which extends south from the bridge to the boundary there. So I like that. It's a relatively short trail. I've taken my grandchildren there. They've had a great fun there, elementary school age. They've had a lot of fun there with all the birds and other things that you can see there as well. So thank you for the question. I always like to plug that trail. Okay, so here is just a little bit of the wildlife that you might see while you're visiting the refuge. At certain times of the year, there are quite large crowds of birds. Here you see some American white pelicans in the foreground and some avocets in the background. And I'll talk more about both those birds in a few minutes when I have images of them specifically. But here I want to talk about two endangered species that live in the marshes. The salt marsh harvest mouse that you see on the left is a mouse that lives in the marshes. And back when marshes surrounded San Francisco Bay, there was a lot of area for this mouse. Now, as you've seen with so many marshes destroyed, this mouse is now endangered because of the lack of habitat. This animal also only lives in San Francisco Bay area, around San Francisco Bay. We call that endemic when an animal is from this area and only lives in this area. So the animal lives in the tidal marshes, mostly in a plant that you see on the left side of this picture called pickleweed. That is a plant that grows in the salty soil of the marsh, and it serves the mouse both as a home and as a food. You can see that this mouse is small. It's only about 2 inches long as your thumb, not counting its tail. You can't see its tail in this picture, but it has a long, thin tail that's actually longer than its body. And one of the uses that its tail, or that it does with its tail, is helpful when it is swimming. This is the only species of mouse that has adapted to swim, and that's important when it lives in a marsh, and it could be caught unawares when the tide comes in and be in a body of water and need to swim. And when it is swimming, that tail acts as a rudder to help the mouse go in the direction it wants to go. The mouse is nocturnal. You can tell that by those big eyes that it has. It needs to have big eyes so it can see in low light of nighttime, which is when it comes out and it feeds. The mouse has the ability to drink and utilize salt water. It is the only land mammal that can survive drinking salt water. It has adapted its kidneys to getting rid of the salt and then providing the rest of the body with the fresh water. So that in and of itself makes it special. Its life cycle is 9 months. So in 9 months, it must grow to maturity, mate, and bring up some young before it dies. And you can see how difficult that is in the limited range of marshland that we now have remaining. So our biologists occasionally will set out a trap to capture the mouse, and they set it out overnight. And if there's a mouse, they will capture it or get it out of the trap in the morning and measure it and study it however they need to study it. And you see this mouse has a little tag that has been attached to its ear. And I suspect, I don't know the origin of this photograph, but I suspect that this was taken after the mouse was examined and released, which is why it's out there during the daylight instead of at night. Another endangered species is the bird here that today we call the Ridgway's rail. In the past, until a few years ago, it was called the clapper rail. The reason for the name change was that an ornithologist by the name of Robert Ridgway determined that the group of birds that we call clapper rail were actually 3 different species. And so this bird got a new name. It was named after him after he passed away. This bird is also endemic to the San Francisco Bay Area, meaning it exists only here. It's also threatened because of population decrease, not only because of the loss of habitat, but because this bird was hunted avidly during the late 19th and early 20th century, when hunters came to the marshes that are now part of the refuge and other marshes around San Francisco Bay, and they hunted ducks and geese and clapper rails. There was a report in a newspaper in the 1880s that 5,000 of these birds were shot in 1 week. So that's how prevalent they were. Today, it's estimated there are a total of 1,250 birds around San Francisco Bay. So 1/4 of 1 week's kill is all that survives today. And that's an increase because 10 or 15 years ago, there were only estimated to be 750 of those birds. So we have made some strides in helping to protect it, but there's a way to go before it can be considered no longer threatened. This bird, the name rail, for a whole family of birds, does not have anything to do with long, thin things such as railroad rails and other kinds of things. Rail. We have a different meaning to the word rail, which comes from a French root, and that is the verb to make a loud noise. If you rail against something, you make a loud noise in stating your objections or your ideas about it. And these birds make a loud noise, kind of a clicking or clapping noise, and thus the name clapper rail is attached to them. Another thing that the refuge does today, I talked about how marshes protect flooding. This is Alviso, which is the area of San Jose that's adjacent to some of the refuge. And Alviso is actually 12 feet below sea level, most of the area of Alviso. It is the lowest spot in the San Francisco Bay Area. And that is due to man-made action. The reason the land is so low is over time, settlers and residents they pulled out the water from the aquifers under the land, which was a source of fresh water, and that caused the land to subside and sink. And as a result, there was prevalent flooding in Alviso, as you see from this 1983 picture. So now that we've restored some of the marshes that absorbs water, but more importantly, the marshes that are adjacent to Alviso have the water level controlled. Bay water flows through these marshes, but flows through gates so that we can keep the water level constant while the water level on the bay side goes up and down with the tides and can go up high during high tide periods. The water on the marsh level stays flat within a couple of inches. And so where it abuts Alviso, there is no flooding. Not all of Alviso is protected by that, but parts of it are. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a photograph in a couple of minutes. So the restoration project that I talked about earlier continues. This is phase 2 of the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. Some of it is in Eden Landing, as you see at the top, and 3 other areas within the refuge, and those are going on as we speak. It is the part of the area opposite on the other side of 84 in the Ravenswood area, and some in Alviso and here in the Mountain View area as well. Plus today we have another restoration project. It's called the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Project. Now the main purpose of this project is to heighten and strengthen the levees in the area of the South Bay to protect the adjacent areas with the projected sea level rise over the coming decades. So this phase of the project, which just started last year, is strengthening the levees down here in the zigzag line that I have colored yellow. And you see that that's the boundary of Alviso. So this will help to protect Alviso. This will help to protect other parts of San Jose. Right behind these levees is San Jose's, the San Jose, Santa Clara County Water Pollution Control Plant. So this is the plant that processes our sewage water and cleans it up before it gets sent into San Francisco Bay. And as part of this project, there is also restoration of some of the salt ponds. So this larger area that I've circled in green, there are 6 salt ponds here. You can see delineated from the lines. And they have been protected as part of the refuge for years, but they haven't been restored. And I'll show you what that means in the next slide. But now they are going to be restored as part of the project. And there's a pond over here that's owned by San Jose that is now protected and is being restored as well. So this project, the first phase, should end sometime next year. This is why, this is that area of the trails 8, 9, and 10 that I showed you. And this is why that area, most of the trails are closed off because there's construction. And in fact, I'll show you a picture of that too coming up. So this project will restore the marshes and some ponds. So part of the refuge is restored as a pond rather than as a marsh. And it is not a pond for salt harvesting. It is a pond for the animals that like a more watery environment than a tidal marsh. And I'll show you a picture of that shortly, but there are some birds mostly birds that like that kind of environment, and there are fish in the water, which are food for the birds. And in these ponds, there are some islands that the birds can use for resting and nesting. And so that is a different type of restoration. Also in those, the restored ponds in the refuge will have more trails, will have viewing platforms, interpretive stations, overlooks. We'll have some access to waterways for people who want to use small boats. There'll be some access to fishing and hunting where it can be done consistent with the wildlife's mission, the Wildlife Refuge mission. And we'll have flood protection. The restoration will help strengthen the endangered species, and we will be able to expand and continue our educational programs, one of the primary people-oriented missions of the refuge. So here is a picture of some of the protected but not yet restored area that abuts San Francisco. So you can see that the area is pretty lifeless. It has a railroad track going through it, but it's just sitting there with water that is idle and land where no plants are growing. To make a long story very short and very simplified, basically to restore it, what is done is bringing in dirt to bring the land up to the marsh level and carving some channels for sloughs to go throughout the marsh. And then literally opening it up to San Francisco Bay. Right now, those are sealed off from San Francisco Bay, as that area was when it was used for salt harvesting. So that's why the water is just sitting there. There's no life in it. And once it opens to San Francisco Bay and the bay water comes in, nature takes over. We don't plant plants there and bring fish in. That's all done naturally. And then the birds and other animals come in, and it's really a great story. I'm sorry about that. Okay, So here is a picture of the restoration that's going on in Alviso as part of the Shoreline project. This is actually our marsh right behind the Environmental Education Center. It's a little more full with water than it usually is, which may just be a function of all the rain that we had earlier this year. But it will come back to its kind of normal orientation once the construction is finished. And here is some of the things that we do for the public, for both adults and school children. On the left is a picture of an event we had. It was actually the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Refuge, which took place last October. That's one of our staff members on the right, talking about this pollution model that is on the table. And the way this model works is the visitor gets some colored water, just water with food coloring, and pours it on the part of the model that represents the inhabited area. And the water starts running down to the bay, and as if the pollution would go to the bay, but there's some simulated marshland in there, and you can see visually how the marsh prevents the pollution from reaching the bay. So it's a simple concept, but it's strengthened by being able to see a model of it in action. And then over on the right is our summer camp, which we have historically had over the years. The pandemic, of course, threw a monkey wrench in that. So we had a virtual camp one year. Last summer, we had a hybrid camp. And I believe there is going to be some sort of camp again this summer as well. So that's something that we do for the children in the area besides the school classes that we have during the school year. Okay, that's my story of the refuge. I have just a few slides to talk about some of the wildlife here. These are two of the common shorebirds, the avocet on the right that I've talked about. This is its non-breeding season coloration. And the black-necked stilt on the left, you can see how the stilt gets its name from its black neck. You can also see its beautiful pink legs. And actually, this stilt is the bird with the longest leg-to-body ratio. So it's a world record holder, a very special bird. Both of these birds being shorebirds, or birds who tend to be near the shoreline in shallow water, and they eat by dipping their beaks into that water and looking for worms and tiny clams and other things that live in the mud. The avocet is pretty easy to spot because of that white stripe in its wings, and also it has an upturned beak, which is not very common. It's not the only bird that has an upturned beak, but that's just a small minority of birds, I think, that do have that. Here we have a couple of egrets, the two types of egrets that we have at the refuge, the great egret and the snowy egret. These are not to scale. The great egret is indeed bigger than the snowy egret. I'm proud to say I took both these pictures, and these were at SF2. So one of the reasons why that's my favorite trail. The great egret is, besides by size, it's easily told by its yellow beak and black feet. The snowy egret is just the reverse. It has a black beak and yellow feet, although you can't see that. And this snowy egret was wandering around in the shallow areas of San Francisco Bay, that's right at the edge of that SF2 trail. And it dipped in and got that fish. And it was so proud, it literally paraded around with that fish for a minute or two before it tilted its head back and swallowed the fish. Here we have another great egret, along with a closely related bird, the great blue heron. You do see some herons at the refuge. They're scarcer than egrets, but they are around, and you often see them just sitting in one place, stone still for long periods of time, just waiting and watching. This one is a little more active. It was wandering around in the water. And there we have the American white pelican that I showed you earlier. There is another species of pelican in the Bay Area, the brown pelican. You won't see that at the refuge. You will see that in deeper water areas like the Golden Gate and along the Pacific coast. And the reason is those are diving pelicans. You will see them flying over in a line 30, 40, 50 feet above the water. And they're looking down in the water. And if they see a fish that looks tempting, they will dive in and get it. So they will not survive in the shallow waters of this refuge. But the white pelicans are different. And as you will see in a minute, they feed by dipping their beaks into the water. And so they just swim along and feed from the fish there. I wanted to talk about these black feathers that they have. Some birds have them besides the pelican. You can't see these feathers when their wings are folded in, but you can see them now and you can see them when they're flying. The reason they're black is because those feathers contain melanin, which is a colored substance. And the reason they contain that is it helps protect them from wind shear. It makes those wings stiffer, stronger, more resistant to wind shear, so they're not damaged as easily while the bird is flying. So now I'm going to close with I'm sorry, I'm a little too fast on the trigger here. I am going to close with this very short video. I'm sorry, lost control here. If I go past it, PowerPoint shuts it down. So let me go slowly. Okay, this is a video that I took, not at SF2, at one of the other trails, of a group of penguins feeding, pelicans feeding, and they tend to swim out literally in a line, and they find a school of fish, and they group themselves into a circle to trap the fish, and they go feeding. But not all the fish that get trapped, some of them escape. And you see here, there are a bunch of snowy egrets that are happy to freeload on the work of the pelicans and feed on the fish. So here, take a look at the pelicans and the snowy egrets.
And actually, we can't see your screen, Larry.
Did I stop sharing?
You did. Wait, it got messed up when the video played, but we are very much looking forward to seeing the pelicans.
Okay. Yes, it did. And I didn't notice that. Okay. Thank you for letting me know. Did you saw the other slides though, right?
Yes, it was just the video.
Okay. So let me move this out of the way. Okay. Pelicans and egrets. A lot of fun. If you visit the refuge often enough, you'll see a lot of interesting behaviors and activities, such as this one. And so I encourage you all to visit it. If you haven't visited, please come and see what the refuge has. And if you have visited, try some of the different trails maybe that you haven't seen. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for sitting through all of this. And now Olivia and I will be glad to answer questions, and I will intentionally stop sharing. And we'll go from here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Larry. We've got some clapping reactions coming your way. I just wanted to say thank you again. I'm always impressed with the amount of knowledge that you're able to share with us. So thank you so much. I always learn something new. Always appreciate that. And I guess before we head into Q&A, I'll probably just leave you off with one last final message here. Larry did a great job talking about the history of pollution in the San Francisco Bay. And a lot of folks toward the ends of these presentations usually ask, okay, well, what can we do about this? What can we do about current pollution problems? What can we actually tangibly do. And one of the ways that we can do that is by protecting our watersheds. So I'm going to put a link into the chat here with some more pollution prevention tips, because the way that our streets and our storm drains work is that all of the water from all that recent rain that we had, all of that flows to our creeks and to the San Francisco Bay without any treatment, which is a common misconception, especially in the Bay Area. And it flows through our refuge before reaching the San Francisco Bay. So we're so lucky that we do have all of these restored tidal marshes that Larry talked about that are helping to filter out some of those pollutants, but it really does start at the source. The bay starts at your front door, and we can all do a little bit to help protect, whether it's taking your car to the car wash instead of washing it in the driveway, or making sure that it's maintained properly so there's no oil spills, picking up trash in your neighborhood and things like that. There are lots of small little things that we can all do to help protect our incredible refuge. And hopefully after everything that Larry talked about this evening, you'll have another appreciation and love for the refuge now. And it looks like we've got some great responses in the chat there, Larry. And yes, I hope you all have a chance to go to the refuge, get some photographs, as you've seen Larry's incredible photographs there. And then I'll open it up to any questions that you have before we sign off for the evening. And I also went ahead and put our program email into the chat. So if you think of any questions later or have anything that you want to pass on to Larry, I'm always happy to do that. Oh, we have a question. Please discuss the effects of freshwater diversions from the rivers that feed the Delta Bay Estuary. That's a good question. Do you want to tackle that one, Larry?
I can talk a little bit about that one. We could do a whole program on that one. That is a serious problem. In some of the programs I do, I talk about current threats to the Bay, which I haven't done tonight. And one of those threats is the freshwater diversion. For anyone who doesn't know, there's been a history from early in the 20th century of diverting water that comes down from the Sierra Nevada that would normally go into the string of bays, Sassoons at Pablo Bay and San Francisco Bay, and diverting that to the Central Valley and to Southern California. And there have been more and more diversions. And that changes the mix of the water in San Francisco Bay. It lets the salt water come much further up, and sometimes the salt water will extend almost all the way to San Francisco, to Sacramento, which we should not be doing. That threatens the wildlife in that area, which is not accommodating to salt water. It expects the birds and the animals there expect fresh water. And there are still people who want to divert more water. And at some point, the water then in San Francisco Bay will become too salty and will start affecting the wildlife that's here. I don't know if that already has had an effect, but it certainly potentially can. And this is a big political thing about whether to do that or not. I don't know if there's a way to actually write a law to protect it, but there's no such law now. And it's up to California and maybe parts of the federal government to whether they determine to do that or not. So it is a very serious consideration, and it's worth following in the news when you see something about that.
Yeah, that was an excellent answer, Larry. And I'll just add that as we are going forward with climate change mitigation, the best way going forward is creating additional resilient ecosystems. And hopefully by keeping them more historically accurate, that's definitely the best way forward, regardless of the issues. So hopefully that's a good one as well. But yes, I highly recommend looking into it more. That was a great question. Do we have any others from the chat, or feel free to come off of mute if you're comfortable doing that? We'd love to hear your questions or thoughts or stories or anything. Thank you so much.
Yes,
okay,
thank you.
I think I'll call it there. But again, if you have any other additional questions that you think of after, please feel free to email us at watershedwatchers@sfbayws.org. I'll definitely pass any of those on to Larry. I will also be sending out the recording of the presentation if there's anything else that you would like to go over again, looking at any of those awesome maps or photos. And we hope that you will join us at the next presentation. Thank you all so much for sticking with us, and we hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.